competing. Did you ever, because a lot of people don't like the appearance of bodybuilders, they think it's kind of grotesque. Was that hard for you to deal with people saying to you, you look hard, you're too big, you're too...
No. As a matter of fact, I was always a bit of a rebel throughout my life, and the thought that I would be different from other people never bothered me, and when I heard that it bothered other people, it even gave me more impetus to continue training.
Born in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and at the age of 2 moved to Lancaster County, a small town called Ephrata, Pennsylvania, which is kind of a farming community, which is where the Pennsylvania Dutch and the Mennonites, that culture predominates, I guess. My mother had been married previously to a man who got killed in a car accident or something.
We had a fairly solid upbringing. We taught the difference between right and wrong. We were expected to do certain things. My father expected us to maintain a certain level of discipline around the house.
My dad had been a truck driver all his life. He never had any formal education.
He was a tough-minded individualist, always find it easy to stand up for what he believed in. In fact, he at times reveled in it. Not that his was a crusading spirit, but he was not averse to a fight. And from time to time, he would even boast about his integrity and strength of conviction, which had a way of irritating some of the, what I refer to as weak-willed, nancy-pantsy types around us. My brother Ray and I responded very strongly to my father's self-esteem, which resulted in our becoming staunch individualists. I remember a number of occasions when people referred to the Mentzers, my father, my brother, and I, as arrogant and conceited, which only served at the time to fuel my nascent individualism. Actually, we were not arrogant and conceited, or conceited. We were just out of ourselves. My father, who, while not an intellectual, learned something about the value of knowledge in the course of his life and sought to inculcate that value in me. I can remember he would reward me when I did well in school. He would give me money or gifts. I remember one time he gave me a $20 bill and another gave me a baseball mitt to help to encourage my continued hard study, doing well in school. My father was always proud of the good marks that I got in school. He would brag about me to his friends and other relatives. That's bound to have a strong impact on me. The other influences were a few teachers who were intelligent and benevolent enough to identify the fact that I had a good mind. The effect that my father and these specific teachers had on me by applauding my mind was the greatest childhood influence I had in looking back, without a doubt.
I was never considered a bookworm as a youngster. As I got a little bit older, in my teens, I started becoming more bookish. But never the typical bookworm type, I don't think. I don't recall ever being called a bookworm. I started to read a lot and continue to read as often as I can.
I was very athletic. As a matter of fact, I played some junior high school football very well. Did well in track. I did extremely well in swimming. I was the physical fitness champion of our high school 4 or 5 years in a row. I was always out in the backyard doing push-ups, sit-ups, jumping fences, climbing trees. I enjoyed all that stuff, but all of that changed immediately when I discovered bodybuilding.
Well, it's one of those proverbial, often heard stories in bodybuilding. I was at a drugstore with my mother in my hometown of Ephrata, Pennsylvania, and while she was off doing some shopping, I was looking over the magazines, and all of a sudden my attention was arrested by the sight of a muscle man. And I knew instantly, there was no lag time, this is what I was going to be, and it was a love affair, and I've been doing it ever since.
Well, my dad bought me a set of weights, which is all I had access to for a while. And I trained by myself for, perhaps a year or two. Was making noticeable progress by the ages of 14 and 15. Matter of fact, I had some photographs taken at around that time, maybe I was 16, and I was already looking like a well-developed advanced bodybuilder without the steroids. That's when I knew. I can remember I was very impressed at one point by how my development was proceeding, and I thought, geez, I'm really starting to look like those guys. There's no reason why I shouldn't continue. All I have to do is make the commitment, and I'll do it. I didn't know anything about genetics at the time. Probably other young men have that same notion, but not being as genetically well endowed, they don't make it. But I so happened that I did. As my father saw my continued interest, my interest continuing, he suggested I meet one of his lifelong buddies, a guy that he was very close with in his teenage years, this man named John Myers. And I was invited to train with him 3 times a week, along with his training partner and friend, a man named Russell Britton. Actually, I continued training with them for several years. John was good enough in 1965 to bring me to New York City from my hometown in Pennsylvania to meet the first Mr. Olympia contest. I was very fortunate. I got to see Larry Scott with the first Mr. Olympia. That had an enormous impact. I can remember that serving to fuel my ambition to go further. I can recall watching Larry Scott arrive and people going literally crazy. Seeing Larry Scott was almost a religious experience. I remember after the contest, I was determined to get backstage to see him, so I climbed the fire escape, and lo and behold, I ended up walking right into the dressing room where Larry Scott and Dave Draper were, and I stood there gawking while he wiped the oil off of his enormous arms. I clearly recall being even more impressed by his calves. I had never seen a professional bodybuilder before. Seeing his calves from behind while he was drying the oil, I got so excited I couldn't contain myself. Larry was quite friendly, and then as he was leaving, the guards ushered everybody out. I had to go down the elevator with he and Dave Draper. That was exciting too, and upon leaving there were still people outside waiting. I got that impression again as to how exciting it must be to have fans waiting for you as you're leaving the hall. Matter of fact, I can remember sitting down with Muscle Builder, because that was the IFBB magazine, and deciding to go into the IFBB at some point because that's where the Mr. Olympia was. I recall taking a pen, and on one of the pages inside the Muscle magazine, writing down Mr. America, underneath that Mr. Universe, underneath that Mr. Olympia. And I had placed next to each of those titles, I wrote down the year that I planned on winning them. I may have been 14 at the time. It was the Mr. Lancaster County contest. I lived in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. They had their annual contest. It was my first contest, and I won rather handily. I had beaten some of the guys from the city who I used to look up to. And there were quite a few good bodybuilders in that area. And I must have been about 18. A year after that, at the age of 19, I went into the state contest, Mr. Pennsylvania, and won that. rather easily. At that point, I was starting to look real good. When I was 19, I started using steroids. I was taking a couple of Advil tablets a day, and they helped out quite a bit. I was training up 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. But at the age of 18, being young and restless, wanting to escape the dominion of my dad, went into the Air Force for 4 years, which is why I ended up in Washington, D.C. Well, at age 20, I was pretty screwed up, as many young men are. At that period, I was in the Air Force and really didn't know what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a doctor and a bodybuilder, but I hadn't seen that much of the world and felt as though I had to have a certain amount of worldly experience before I pursued anything. I joined the Air Force to see the world and ended up in Washington, D.C., about 150 miles away from my home, so I didn't see a whole hell of a lot, but it was the big city, and I did become more worldly. I went from there to the teenage Mr. America and got second place, winning all the best body part awards. Well, as a matter of fact, I was good enough to go into Mr. America. As a matter of fact, I did at the age of 19. 1971. That was the year that Casey Theater won. Casey won all the body part awards, best arms, best back, best legs. I got second in the best arms and best legs contest. Casey was very, very impressive. I think a couple months older than I am. But I remember being extremely impressed with him backstage prejudging. We all stripped down and I saw this 19-year-old kid looking like Mr. Olympia. I went through the roof. I couldn't believe my eyes. He approached me and told me how good he thought my genetics were. I didn't understand that term at the time. No one had spoken about it much with regard to bodybuilding. And he suggested I call his mentor, Arthur Jones. I do recall the first time I called him, he wasn't in. But he did call me back. The theory that he advanced back in the early 70s, the theory of high-intensity training, whose principles are that exercise has to be intense, frequent, and frequent, is universally valid. Right after the Mr. America contest, where I placed 10th behind Casey, I injured my right shoulder rather severely during a set of flat bench dumbbell flies. I could not train for almost 8 months after that. I couldn't raise my arm from my side, in fact. During that 8 months of inactivity, I became disheartened, a little bit depressed about it all. Didn't know how to direct my efforts elsewhere. Ended up getting not fat, but more overweight than I should have. And after the Air Force, I stayed there for 3 more years, really kind of floating about aimlessly, not knowing quite what I wanted to do. I had gone to school. I went to Prince George's County Community College for a while. It's where I met Catherine, by the way, in a philosophy class. And then went to the University of Maryland for a while in the pre-med program. But there was still this thing in my mind about bodybuilding. I had to get that out of the way first. And then finally in 1974, it became evident that bodybuilding was starting to take off as a popular sport. With Arnold's success and then pumping iron, I knew I wanted to make it. So I put my foot down. I said, look, I don't want to end up 50 or 60 years old and to look back and say, well, gee, I could have done that, but I didn't try. I decided in 1974 that I was going to go back into it. And just for the purpose of getting back into a reasonable condition, not with the idea of competing, started training again 3 days a week, just a couple sets of body part. And in no time at all, started ballooning up and decided that perhaps it was time to start thinking about competition again. I stayed in the Washington, D.C. area and went to school for right around 3 years. I was studying pre-med. I was taking biology, chemistry, mathematics, things that might get me into medical school. My goal at the time was to become a psychiatrist, as I had always had a fascination with the mind. I remember at that time I was reading a lot of Freud and R.D. Lang. That turned out I did not finish college. As a matter of fact, in part due to Joe Weider. I didn't compete in 74. No, I'm sorry, I didn't. I competed in small shows in Holyoke, Massachusetts. As a matter of fact, there was a Junior Mr. America contest I won up there. That wasn't bad, right around 190 pounds, which wasn't bad for a young bodybuilder at 5'8". That got me very excited. I thought if I could win Junior Mr. America in the ISBB, of course the next step was the Mr. America. And in fact it was. 1975, Franco Colombo put on the Mr. America contest here in Los Angeles. I placed third behind Robbie and Roger Callard. I came out here actually expecting to win, but upon reaching backstage and seeing Robbie Robinson swallowing real hard, I realized that I was not going to win. I didn't take it hard either. Upon seeing Robbie, I just, well, whatever happened, happened. If I didn't win, I didn't really care about second or third. I knew Robbie was going to win, and he did very handily. It was an important show, however, because that's where I met Joe Weider. I remember very clearly being backstage, pumping up before the pre-judging, and I couldn't get over the fact that Joe Weider was back there, and he spent all of his time staring at me. I was literally shocked. I thought, gee, I knew I looked good, but I didn't think I looked that good. And then he was actually very kind and gracious. He walked up to me after the contest, invited me to a photo session. That was Saturday, with the next Monday morning at a studio in downtown Los Angeles with Russ Warner. And he was very impressed at the photo session and invited me out to his offices the next day so I could do a series of 4 interviews with Gene Mosé. Ended up as quite a spread in Muscle Builder, several pages with lots of photos. And I spoke at length about the high-intensity training program. Even Gene, during the interview, was quite surprised that I was only training 3 to 5 sets per body part, 2 days a week. And then, of course, the magazine received quite a bit of mail after that. And I kept doing articles, and the more articles I did, the more response the magazine got, the more response I got. As it turned out, one of those photos from Russ's photo session ended up on the cover of Muscle Builder. I was ecstatic. I didn't know it was going to be on the cover. I don't think Joe told me it would be. But it did, and I remember being at the newsstand in Washington, D.C., and running home and calling Joe and thanking him for it. He invited me at that point to come out here to California permanently to live and work perhaps. But I was still in college and turned it down. I went back to Maryland and did go to school. Very, very happy about that decision. But knew that I wanted to be the best. According to my own timetable, I had to win the next year or 2. So I trained like crazy after the 75 America with my brother back in Washington. Trained very, very heavy that winter. And improved enough to not just win the contest, but totally freak out the judges and people had seen me the year before because I gained 14 pounds of muscle. And they thought I was a different human being. They didn't even recognize me. I went from being a distant third to a very easy first place win, having beaten Roger Callard on every judge's scorecard but one, and that was Arnold's. There were 9 judges, and every single judge voted for me but Arnold. Of course, Arnold was Roger's training partner. But that was the beginning once you win the America, or at least for me it was. That's a stepping stone, a greater stimulus to continue. I went on to the 76 Mr. Universe in Montreal where Robbie won. I didn't really think I'd beat Robbie until that night. I thought I had gotten a greater audience reception and people were coming up, Lou Ferrigno, Coyer Co, and said that, hey, you could really win this thing. But in the back of my mind, in my heart, I knew that there was no way I was going to beat this guy. And not only did I think he looked better, but he was getting all the publicity. And I noticed that Ben Weider was introducing him to all the Montreal dignitaries in the audience. He didn't even shake my hand, didn't even recognize my existence. In the winter of 76, January, February, I was walking go quarter to a half mile between classes at the University of Maryland campus. It was freezing. I didn't have any money. I was working for a doctor on the side. I had a girlfriend. I was just generally having a rough time of it. I was also becoming disheartened about the idea of becoming a psychiatrist. I was tired of being broke, so I called Joe and let him know that I was willing to come out if the invitation was still open, and it was. What I decided to do was, in June of that year, fly to Vancouver, British Columbia, to compete in the Mr. North America contest, which was going to be attended by Joe. I did very well at that contest. I was outstanding and won, and Joe was excited again. It wasn't the greatest competition in the world, but Darcy Beckles and myself and my brother and two other top names made it respectable. On the way down to California from D.C. in the airplane, we spoke in language. I decided to definitely make the trip to California. Matter of fact, I stayed there. So my girlfriend was still back in Washington, D.C. We had an apartment. She went about making the arrangements to come out, followed me a month or so later, and I ended up staying for good. And glad that I did. I had no regrets. I ended up living for about a year or so in a building that Joe's aunt owns on Beverly West, LA, which I enjoyed very much. Kathy and I had a very good year there. During the course of that year, my mail order came out and started doing very well. The lodgings were not spacious enough to accommodate the inventory. Moved down the street. When I first moved here in June of '77, I was associate editor. I was in the office every single day. I only stayed in the office, and I continued working in the office for approximately, maybe just 6 months. Once I was here, and the word got out, I started receiving quite a large volume of requests for exhibitions. And because I was traveling all the time after a certain point, Joe agreed to just let me continue writing without having to appear in the office. In fact, Joe and I got along extremely well. Many people thought that he sort of looked upon me as a son that he never had. He was quite happy to be around me, and he was proud. He would invite Kathy and I out to dinner, up to 2 times a week. He would invite me over to his residence on weekends, and we would go to his library and talk about philosophy and art. So I was very fond of him. And the '77, of course, was much worse because I lost to Cal Scala, having been designated the favorite that year. But even that didn't bother me so badly. I've never taken defeat that bad. Cal was in very, very good shape, where I was definitely off, not quite at my peak. I've never been devastated by a defeat. I don't view defeat as failure. It's just one step in the learning process. If I lose a contest, then I analyze the situation. I analyze my physique, my performance, and try to improve on it the next time. But I don't feel as though I've been lessened or diminished in stature as a person because I lost to Cal Scala.
All these guys are great champions. Losing to them is no big deal. But then having lost the 77 universe, I realized I better get my act together or forget about making a career of bodybuilding, and came back in 78 and won with a perfect score.
I knew that I had to win the 78 universe or certificate goodbye, so I trained very, very hard for the 78 universe. Fortunately, did win that one with the first and only perfect score. In terms of personal satisfaction and elation, it was not what winning the Mr. America was. Winning the Mr. America involved a sense of achievement and triumph that nothing else after even came close to. I was glad to have won the universe, of course, especially with the 300 perfect score, but it was anticlimactic. There was a point where I was thinking, what was I to go through all of that for?
I know a lot of people, it seems like the bodybuilding era is starting to pick up more in the last, say, 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, I think so.
And a lot of these athletes, men and women, come from different sports. Do you consider bodybuilders to be athletes, or would you consider the sport more of a discipline?
Well, I think all sports involve discipline. It depends upon how you define sport. The fact that you have all these men around the world engaged in serious physical training, which will eventually culminate in the pursuit of a competitive goal, I think it's a sport.
Having just won the 78 universe in February 7th, my picture was appearing on the covers of magazines. I was appearing on national TV shows like Merv Griffin, getting a lot of publicity. I was making a lot of money. That was the high point, without a doubt. As a matter of fact, the 1979 Southern Professional Cup, that was my first professional contest. I went there in a top physical condition and also mental condition. I went there feeling the way I had felt for the 76 America. I knew that I was in my best shape and would take on monsters and beat me. Prior to the prejudging, backstage, when we were all stripping down, the one guy I knew that I had to worry about was Robbie. And when I saw him stripped down, I knew it again, just as I knew down all the way to my toenails. I was going to win the America. I looked at Robbie and I thought, there's no way this guy's going to beat me. I was very happy, too, because I was experimenting immediately prior to that for the first time with rest pause training. And it worked. I had cut my workouts back to only 7 sets. That was one of my most heavily muscled conditions. I remember my muscles feeling heavier. I just felt heavily muscled, and more heavily muscled at that contest than any other contest. And I was almost as ripped as I was at the 80 Olympia. I was very big and very hard. I thought I deserved it, and I did, and I was very happy about that. A month or two after that, there was a professional contest in Pittsburgh, which I lost to Robbie Robinson. Actually, I had won the prejudging. I was even during the prejudging, I was in the best condition of my life. But after the prejudging, I made the mistake of going out and eating indiscriminately. At that point, I didn't understand diet and fluid intake as well as I was to later. I learned about it in part from the mistakes that I made after the prejudging of that contest. During the prejudging, I was absolutely enormous. My muscles were filled to the brim with glycogen, and my skin was extremely tight, adhering to the muscles almost like cellophane. I remember being impressed for the first time with my pecs, looking down at them under the light backstage and seeing deep striations. I thought, my goodness, this is the best condition. I'm even better now than I was at the last show, and I was better at the last show than I was in the universe, so like, everything's going well. Then I made a mistake. I remember going out right after the prejudging and eating 4 or 5 pancakes, butter and syrup, eating several glasses of orange juice, and then going to the final show that night and being clearly aware of myself that something was not as it had been that morning. I was quite disappointed, and I was afraid it would cost me the show, and ultimately it did. I had won the prejudging with a perfect score there, too. I was ahead of Robbie Robinson, and I knew it. Robbie seemed disheartened, but that night, it's enough to piss anybody to go to Robbie. Although there was contest after that Pittsburgh show. There was a contest in New York a month later, the 79 Night of Champions.
Now, the competition that's developing between you and Robinson, does this give you an added incentive? Does this spur you on?
Gives me added incentive and added pressure, but it's not just between Robbie and I, it's everybody here. These guys are all top pros and anybody can win.
Okay, good luck to you.
Thank you.
At that show, I was in third place behind Robbie Robinson and Kenny DeVille, and I deserved it. It was right around that time that my mother became very ill, and that particular stress, on top of the stress of having just trained so hard for 3 shows in a row in a short period of time, left my motivation flagging, and I didn't even think about winning that show. I had a contractual arrangement with the people that put it on, and I went there for that reason, not to win, not thinking that I would or even cared. My mother's terminal illness was upmost in my mind. I can remember, as a matter of fact, while in New York, the night prior to the show, I received some very bad news from the doctor. And Kathy was there and was kind enough to help keep my emotions under control. But I went ahead and performed in the contest. My mother ended up dying 2 weeks after that contest. And that hurt me very much because right at that point in my life, to where I was becoming successful and had the money to give her to travel with me, perhaps to Europe. I wanted very much for her to leave our hometown, at least for a while, and come out to California. She didn't live long enough. That hurt very much. I went into quite a bit of a depression and stopped training actually for about 6 weeks, during which time I ate way too much, put on way too much fat. I lost almost all of my motivation. It was towards the end of June, 6 weeks later, 6 weeks after the New York contest, I decided if I was going to go on the 79 Olympia, I better pull myself out of that rut. I was in the worst condition I'd been in years. I was barely looking like a bodybuilder. I was flat. I had lost considerable size. There was not even a hint of abdominal definition. So I went through my mental gymnastics. I started revving myself up, whipping myself up into a lather, and finally became very tenacious, put my foot down, went on a diet, started hard training for the Olympia, which I think was in October of that year. Put myself into pretty good shape, although I can recall very clearly this incident. 3 weeks before the contest, my brother Ray looked at me and said, "Steve, Mike, you've had a rough year. Our mother died, so everybody will understand. Why don't you just put it off?" That didn't deter me. It didn't even prompt me to think that I wouldn't make it, although it gave me a little bit more of an incentive to push. The last 3 weeks before the Olympia, I improved 300%, to put such a quantification on it. I was training very hard up to that point. That last 3 weeks, and this is the way it usually goes, even with most bodybuilders. The last 3 or 4 weeks, you pull out all the stops. You know that it's going to be over soon, that you can't take the punishment. You're going to give it everything you possibly can, and I did. The feeling that I had the morning that I woke up that day, I had accumulated a lot of knowledge in the preceding year about reaching a peak of condition. I learned a lot from that Pittsburgh show, where I messed up an evening performance. I kept voluminous notes. I poured over my notes over and over again, and I kept daily records. I knew how to watch for patterns as my weight changed, as body water levels. I worked all that out and knew I'd be ready for the 79 Olympia, and it worked out. My idea was confirmed. I woke up that morning. Everything that I thought would work did work, and I was in the best condition of my life. There was no subcutaneous fat, or at least it was so little, it was negligible. I did get in the best shape of my life. I went into that 79 Olympia knowing that I was as big as I'd ever been, but considerably harder. I thought even at that point that I could beat Frank Zane. I thought that my shape and proportions were equal of his, that I would be considerably bigger. There's no reason why I shouldn't be. the vast majority of bodybuilders throughout my training career that I've met thought that bodybuilding was a fat pack. The idea is to build as much mass as you possibly can. Frank Zane looked very good in the 79 Olympia, but he hadn't put any muscle on prior to that for 10 or 15 years, nearly removed himself. And I fully expected to beat Frank Zane, and I did win the three judging. I had placed a very close second to Frank. I was quite disappointed, a bit angry. I was hoping to be the guy who broke the precedent when he won the gun first try. I almost did. I did win the three judging with another perfect score. I thought they want more definition than I'll get even more rip than I wasn't here before, so I paid more attention to diet all year long, something I hadn't done before. I usually waited to start dieting 10 or 12 weeks before the show. I started dieting and doing aerobics in February of that year. I think the contest was in October. I carried my purpose, my goal around with me 24 hours a day. No matter what it was I was doing, taking the garbage out, going to the post office. Everything I did had a heightened sense because I was constantly thinking about that stadium and what was it that I do today in terms of diet, training, aerobics, motivation to improve myself. In addition to heavy training, I was doing a lot of bike riding and even running, and then at different points, a lot of posing. I was physically active almost all day long, and everything that I did was partial onto the side of fruit. And I probably even at a couple points pushed myself hard. I remember 3 times before that 80 Olympia, something a lot of people don't know. I pushed myself to the point where I literally did almost die, but I thought I was going to die. I had drained not just my glycogen levels, also my ATP. When I woke up in the morning, 3 different occasions, each separated by several weeks of sleep, when I literally thought that I had done some irreparable damage to my body. I remember literally not being able to lift my arm without being left breathless. I had pushed myself past the point probably very few human beings have ever done. I placed too much value on winning that contest. That was in Sydney, Australia in 1980. I remember most clearly speaking with Jock Lomar the day before the show at Paul Grant's gym. He was very concerned. He told me that, in fact, Arnold told him he was going to go on the show, and House tried to talk him out of it. I thought, gee, that is interesting. He was very, very concerned, as his friend was concerned. He was concerned that his friend Arnold was going to destroy his legend. So it didn't bother me to hear that he was going to go on the show, especially in lesser conditions, but that he had been sick. Bother me. On the morning of the show, the atmosphere was much different. There was tension there. There was a hostility and negativity that confused everyone's normal perception and, of course, prevented anyone from deriving the pleasure they might have had otherwise. Everything was askew at this point. It was not a normal contest. No one was talking or acting as the way they used to do. There was strain and tension in the air all the way through. Then the issue of the weight classes came up. There was a lot of arguing going on between Arnold and a few of the guys. I wasn't even concerned about that. I didn't care one way or the other. I thought I could win. It was a very large room. There must have been maybe 50 or 60 people in there, and Arnold, as usual, wanted to be the center of attention. He had said something denigrate Samir Badu in front of everyone, something that was uncalled for. He was making a fool out of himself, but at that time I wasn't concerned. I thought if Samir Badu wanted to defend himself, that was his business. So he was going through his antics. At one point, Boyer Coe stood up as a gentleman and said, look, why don't we just let Arnold explain to all of us right here, right now, what his reasons are for wanting to have two weight classes. Maybe we can get to the bottom of this instead of arguing aimlessly. And he did say it in a very gentlemanly fashion. There was no hint of malice or anything negative in his voice. And Arnold snapped back, "Oh Boyer, why don't you stop acting like a baby? Grow up and be a man," which I thought was uncalled for. So I said, "Look, you just accused Boyer of acting like a baby, when in fact you're the one, Arnold, who's acting worse than that." And that pissed him off. He turned and he said, "Oh, come on, Mentzer, we all know that you lost last year because of your big belly." And I allowed that to irritate me perhaps too much, and on impulse I ran over towards him. I scared him. Arnold Schwarzenegger sat down. I continued at him. I was wagging my finger at him, telling him that his behavior was reprehensible, and that it was not Boyer and Co. who needed to grow up again. That irritated Ben Weider, and he stood in between Arnold and I and tried to assert himself, but it became very clear, especially later on as the day proceeded, that things weren't the way they should be. In 1980, I placed 5th at the Mr. Olympia, a contest that I and almost everyone else who witnessed it was convinced was fixed.
Well, my immediate gut level reaction was paradoxical as it may sound, was laughing. I just started laughing. It was ludicrous to me. It was so obviously an incorrect decision that my first response was just to laugh.
It's interesting, at the 1980 Olympia, the only people who saw Arnold as the winner were the 7 judges and his closest friends. None of the other competitors saw him as the winner. None of the audience, or very few, only those that were his friends. If it was just me saying this, of course it could be chalked up to sour grapes. Although that's not true. I've lost contests before, I never raised a fuss. But that particular contest was so clearly fixed that every other competitor and many of the fans in the audience raised a fuss.
Yeah, not only that, something that a lot of people don't know about the 1980 Mr. Olympia was that a film was being produced at that time called Arnold's Comeback. The primary investor in that film was Paul Graham, the promoter of that contest. Well, if Arnold didn't win, there wouldn't have been a film called Arnold's Comeback, and all the money that Paul Graham spent would have been wasted.
I came to see quite clearly that there was corruption involved, that evil was not something you merely read about in newspapers and novels, that it's all around us. In some ways, I'm glad the 80 Olympia turned out the way it did. It brought into clear focus for me really what the political establishment in bodybuilding is really all about. For years, I was walking around in a fool's paradise. I thought everyone was as nice a guy as I was. I thought that evil was something you just read about in novels and newspapers. In fact, evil is something that's around all of us. This brought it all into focus, and I didn't want to be involved or associated with people like that, and decided to drop out. There was a rift after the 80 Olympia. Actually, it wasn't so much Joe as Ben. There was one time when I was in the office, and a phone call came in from Ben Weider for me. During the course of the conversation, I can remember yelling at Ben. He was not appreciating some of the things that I was saying about the ISBC with regard to the 80 Olympia. And I remember Joe grabbed the phone. "Why are you yelling at my brothers like that?" And Joe took the phone and talked to Ben. And I can only surmise what Ben said, but whatever it was, Joe's response was, I was standing there, "What do you want me to do? And put a muzzle on the guy?" I was talking a lot. I was saying a lot of things that Ben didn't like. I suspect at one point Ben got very irritated and told Joe to cool it with Mike Mentzer, and they were cooling after a while. I was writing articles, doing a lot of reading and studying, doing seminars and exhibitions, and that's what led to my taking amphetamines. In 1979, I started getting amphetamines from a doctor, not for the purpose of getting high. That was the furthest thing from my mind. I didn't like getting high. As a matter of fact, I had stopped marijuana many years before. I was taking amphetamines as ergogenic aids. I loved being productive. I would wake up every morning at 4 o'clock and read literature and philosophy for a couple, 3 hours, go to the gym. After that, come home and write an article, go back down to the beach and ride bike for 40 miles, come home, take a nap, go back down to the beach area and run 3 to 6 miles, then come home, pose, do some more studying, answer phone calls, do some business with a mail order. But I didn't realize that I had lost sight of the fact that the body and the mind has limitations. I was in love with being conscious. Amphetamines have that effect on a lot of people. I had read some of the literature on it. I had never heard of any long-term physical damage, but I did know that it could possibly result in acute episodes of psychosis. I had studied that years ago as part of my interest in the mind and psychiatry, but I was convinced that I was focused enough. I was convinced that my energies were being channeled in a positive direction, and they were. I don't think there's anything wrong with working as hard as I did as long as you don't have to take stimulants in order to do it. There's a lot of people drinking a lot of coffee every day and smoke cigarettes. Do whatever they can to stay stimulated and be productive. In 1983, I left Los Angeles, where I worked for Joe Weider and his Muscle and Fitness magazine, to go to Florida to work for Arthur Jones at Nautilus. I stayed there for a relatively short period, only 6 months, which is quite interesting, actually. A year or two prior to that, I said to an old friend of mine, I wouldn't mind working for Arthur Jones, if only for 6 months, to get to see how his mind works. As it turned out, it was only 6 months, and I left his employ. Went to Europe, performed numerous exhibitions and seminars, came back for a short period, actually a year and a half. I published and served as editor of my own magazine, Workout for Fitness, which was a more general fitness magazine, softcore bodybuilding magazine, as I called it. It became the central focus of my life for a year and a half. I worked harder than perhaps I'd ever worked in my life, sometimes staying awake 2 or 3 days at a time to meet production schedules. I think in our 12th issue, right in the middle of it, and I got a phone call one day that no more money was going to be given to Workout magazine. I was left high and dry. At that point, I was taking a lot of amphetamines, and that, on top of everything that happened that left me emotionally distraught, did something to my mind that I'm fairly clear about today, although these things are very, very complex. The combination of being emotionally distraught, which can cause an individual to lose conceptual control, combined with amphetamines, did something to my emotional structure that led to my performing a number of irrational acts that got me institutionalized on different occasions for up to 3 months. But there was something going on in my subconscious At that time, I did not understand the importance of philosophical consistency. There were a number of contradictions working in my soul, and I didn't understand the nature of them. And the negative parts took hold. I was not being life-affirming. At one point, I had ceased to care. I was suicidal a couple of times. Because I had nothing that I valued strongly enough, there was no forward direction, literally a day-to-day existence. There were periods of lucidity. For a while, I would be pursuing something in my mind, and I was convinced it was real. I would get institutionalized for it, but I'd be released and think, well, I'm right, they're wrong. I'm going to continue doing it even if it gets me in trouble. Actually, the only person that was, I should say, actually John Little was quite supportive. He was one of the only 2 or 3 people who didn't approach me on the ignorant assumption that I was just literally a psychotic, not knowing what the term meant, therefore writing me off as not worthy of consideration. John understands quite a bit about the power of ideas, the way ideas work in the mind. He understands something about the relationship of the conscious mind and the subconscious. We would talk at length at times about all of this, and I still remember those days quite fondly, and it causes me to think fondly of John Little now. He approached me intelligently, again, not on the assumption that I was psychotic, not knowing what psychosis even means, writing Mentzer off as a loony or a crazy. He knew that there was something going on in my soul that was very serious to me, and when we spoke, it was serious. There was nothing smug, not laughing at me. He never thought I was necessarily even crazy. He was actually interested in the ideas. Some of the ideas were actually quite logical. The basic premises were way off. My thinking was actually quite sound on some of it. This is something I learned about later, too. A lot of people have used logic brilliantly, but their basic premises aren't in reality. They build castles in the cortex. I was still studying, this is the part that interests me the most, I was still studying philosophy. I understood what I was reading, understood the importance of being in control of one's mind. There was a lot I didn't understand. There were forces at work in my subconscious that I literally did not have an explicit understanding of. Ayn Rand points out, that which is not explicit is not in man's control. I didn't have an explicit understanding of what was going on, and therefore I did not have full control. My ex-girlfriend was quite supportive too, emotionally and financially. Most other people, from what I understand now, just wrote Mentzer off as crazy or wasn't understanding anything philosophically about what was going on. Just an opportunity, as John Little pointed out, to say, see, we're not so bad. Mike Mentzer wasn't that great anyway. So by bringing Mike Mentzer down, they kind of elevated themselves. People often laugh, mock, jeer at things they don't understand. One thing that does disappoint me is the fact that there were so few people who seemingly made any sincere attempt to understand or extend any support, just spiritually. I heard from no one during that period. No one wrote me a letter. No one called. No one said, "Gee, I hope you're doing all right." Then again, with some people, I understand they didn't understand it. It was beyond their comprehension at the time. But that's what disappoints me a little bit. And again, it's reflective of our whole society. People really don't make an effort to understand. But it's also true people have their own life dramas going on, and everybody every day goes through things that are traumatic, stressful, and have to deal with what Mike Mentzer was going through. I understand in several cases it's just too much for them. It finally dawned on me that the phantasms I was pursuing were not real. Finally, the last institutionalization, I realized, hey, there's something wrong here. This is too much of this. There's something going on in my mind here that's not right. And I gave it a lot of thought and realized that all of that stuff contradicted everything else I had believed in for a long time, and that's what was right. Get back to what you knew before, Mike Mentzer. That emotional trauma you had with your father dying and the magazine and whatever else, along with the amphetamines, really did do something to your mind and erase all of that and go back to what you did know for sure. I did that, and with that, I was on to a almost immediate recovery. It was that full recognition that everything that started at a certain point in time up until that moment of reflection was literally not true. So I took that particular step. I acted on the conviction that none of that was true. I ripped it out of my mind. That conviction was the turning point. I understand that very clearly now. Because I understand that very clearly, I can work more consciously to create the type of soul or character I want. I know how to intensify positive, rational, psychological processes and material. I know how to, what I refer to as denature or diminish the potency of the negative, irrational material. By taking a strong, positive, conscious, affirmative stand towards a certain mental content, we can be better assured that that will work in our mind for us in the future. When we find something negative in our focal awareness, we can also take an appropriate stand consciously to denature it, diminish its intensity, diminish its potency, help ensure that that same psychological material will not work in our minds with the same kind of intensity it had in the past. This is the way that an individual creates his own soul consciously. I can't say I'm glad it happened. I learned a few things, but as with the bodybuilding period of my life, if I could go back, of course, I wouldn't go do it again. I was down at Gold's Gym right away, seeing clients. I started my own personal training business, which started out quite slowly. I was quite surprised that it did start out very slow. I thought that with my visibility and name recognition, I'd move into that business and it would be a spectacular success right from the outset, but it was not. The first 4 or 5 months, I only had a few clients. Was on the verge of giving up when all of a sudden it just started paying off for whatever reason. It started to flourish.
Talking about your career today as an athletic trainer, are you enjoying sharing your knowledge that you've obtained over the years and sharing it with other people and helping them build their bodies? Is it giving you a lot of personal satisfaction?
Yes, it is. I competed for, up to 10 years, and as you may know yourself, athletic training gets to be a little old as you get older yourself. But now I do enjoy sharing the knowledge that I acquired over the years of my own training with my clients, and it's very, very satisfying.
I've been quite happy with it. Now, 4 years later, it's better still, in part as a result of my continuing my articles in Flex and Muscle and Fitness, and also as a result of several top bodybuilders finally recognizing that heavy-duty, high-intensity training not only works in theory, or is not only true in theory, but that it works in practice. People like Aaron Baker, David Dirk, David Paul, Lee Labrada, and last but not least, Dorian Yates. Prior to winning his first Mr. Olympia last year, and since, he's been very kind to give me a good deal of credit. Apparently he was motivated to start training as a result of having seen my photographs, read my articles, bought and read my books. Not only was he inspired by the image of my physique, but he was brighter than the average bodybuilder. He came to understand the theory of high-intensity training, recognized its validity, used it, and went on to win European, British championships, Night of Champions, and now the 1992 and 93 Mr. Olympias. Many people who may have been wary, skeptical, even openly hostile to the theory of high-intensity training are now not so much so. They're saying, geez, maybe Mentzer was right, or at least he was on to something. If it worked for Dorian Yates and he and Casey Viator and Ray Mentzer, there has to be something to it. When a person goes to medical school to study that particular science, medicine, they study the basic principles of physiology, which are universal. They apply to everybody. If everyone's cells, muscles, and organs were constituted and functioned differently, we'd all be unique physiological entities unto ourselves, and doctors couldn't make diagnoses, perform surgeries, or dispense medicines. It's this fact, the fact that we're all essentially the same anatomically and physiologically, that makes it possible for medical science to exist at all as a viable discipline. Now, the science of exercise, the science of productive bodybuilding exercise, like the science of medicine, is based on the principles of human physiology also. The fact that the basic principles of human physiology are universal, again, is what makes it possible for me to state that there is only one valid theory of training, i.e., one best way to train. It is not my mere opinion that every human being requires intense training to stimulate optimal increases in strength and size. It's a well-established fact beyond debate. Nobody would argue that aerobics is the best way to build muscle. They may not understand it explicitly, but they recognize or sense on some level that the reason for this is that aerobics is too low in intensity to stimulate an optimal increase in strength and size, or any increase in strength or size. It is a well-established fact beyond debate that high-intensity training is an absolute requirement for stimulating increases in strength and size. That's the first principle of the theory of high-intensity training. And because high-intensity training is very, very demanding on the body's limited recovery ability, it follows logically that such training must be brief and infrequent to allow for the production of an increase in strength and size. That's the second part of the theory. In order to allow the body to produce the increase that was stimulated as a result of the training, the workouts have to be brief and infrequent. In other words, bodybuilding is not aerobics. This is the hard part. This is the hard part for most people. Most bodybuilders would find it quite easy to accept the first principle, that you've got to train to failure, that the training has to be very intense. The hard part is in accepting the second two principles, namely that exercise has to be brief and infrequent. They all have in their subconscious the idea that more is better, which is actually an ethical economic principle. More money, more success, i.e. more values are better than less. You can't take a principle from economics or ethics and apply it to bodybuilding and expect optimal results. That's a logical fallacy known as context switching, taking a principle from one context of knowledge and applying it to another and expecting to get something out of it. Bodybuilding is not aerobics. If your goal is to improve upon your endurance, which is what aerobics is about, then it's appropriate to use the more is better principle, because that's your goal, to be able to do more and more work. Bodybuilding requires the application of a different principle, namely harder is better. And the harder you train, the less time you can or should train. One of my favorite analogies here is with track and field. Are you not familiar with the fact that sprinters always have larger, more muscular thighs and calves than distance runners? Well, if it was the sheer volume of the work that was responsible for inducing muscular growth beyond normal levels in human beings, then distance runners would have tremendously large thighs and calves, when in fact, in every case, they have stringy muscles. They grossly overtrain. Sprinters The guys who only run 100 to 400 meters very intensely have tremendously developed legs. They run very, very hard. This prevents them from running for long distances. The longest sprint in Olympic competition is the 400-meter dash. Why isn't there a mile dash? Because no one can run that intensely that long. Likewise with bodybuilding training. When you are training to failure on every set, and you're not resting too long between sets, it's not just that you shouldn't train for long periods, but you literally cannot. No one can. It's in the nature of things. Arthur Jones advanced this theory 20 years ago, namely that to be productive, exercise has to be intense, brief, and infrequent. Those are the three principles of the theory. He was right. I recognized it immediately. While he was explaining it to me, I reflected on my own experience. I connected those ideas with other knowledge I already had. I saw logically, in reason, why this was true. But Arthur Jones was missing one bit of crucial knowledge. Let me explain. When he first advanced that theory 20 years ago, he suggested that everybody trained the full body 3 days a week with 12 to 15 sets of workout. Now, compared to everything else being espoused at the time, all other training theories, that certainly did seem brief and infrequent. But here was the one bit of crucial knowledge he was missing. There exists a wide range of variation among individuals with regard to exercise tolerance. Don't you know certain people who don't tolerate exposure to high-intensity ultraviolet sunlight as well as others? That's a genetic trait. Follow me here. All genetic traits are expressed across a broad continuum. The most directly perceivable genetic trait is height. With regard to height, you've got midgets at one extreme and the giants of the NBA at the other. That's a wide range of expression of a genetic trait, from midget to giant. With intelligence, you've got morons at the far left end and geniuses at the far right and everything in between. Then again, with individual sunlight tolerance, you've got albino Scandinavians at the left end and darker skinned types like Negroes at the right who can tolerate long periods of frequent exposure to high-intensity sunlight. I have the evidence, but don't you think it stands to reason that that same thing would apply to individual exercise tolerance? I have some clients who are only doing 3 sets every 7 days. Until I got them down to that, they were making no progress. That was the one bit of crucial knowledge that Arthur Jones was missing 20 years ago.
Yeah, because the theory that you always hear is that it does require hours and hours to look like that.
The mistaken premise there is that more is better. And the body doesn't necessarily work that way. If 2 hours or 4 hours a day were good, well, why not train 12 hours a day? Training is a form of stress, and up to a certain point in time, exposing the body to stress can be beneficial. But beyond a definite period in time, it can actually be detrimental.
Not more is better, not less is better, but precise is best, just like in medicine. There's something in medicine called the narrow therapeutic window you may be familiar with. There's a certain amount of medication you take, a narrow therapeutic window, and you'll cure the disease, cure the symptoms. Anything beyond the narrow therapeutic window and you go into the negative, you overdose. Exercise science should be properly viewed as flowing from medical science, where in both cases we're looking to effect a positive physical change. In medicine, the first thing the researchers had to do was identify the chemical compound that would serve as the medicine to induce the positive physical change. The next logical step, inevitable step, was to discover how much of the medication in terms of volume, how many pills a day, and frequency, how often. Same thing with exercise science, again too, where we're looking to induce or create a positive physical change.
Mike, I'm sure there's a lot of people out there who would like to improve their physiques and their bodies and would want to go to perhaps a trainer. But what should somebody look at when they are looking into getting a trainer? What are some of the qualifications maybe?
Well, not necessarily his muscular development or even his athletic appearance. It's actually very difficult. Presumably the person's going to the gym because he knows little or nothing about training. I think the only way to do it would be to assess his general intelligence level and listen as to how well he explains the principles of productive exercise, as to whether or not he has a grasp of the principles of exercise.
I had a standing policy as a young man of always looking for someone to admire, look up to. That was on the level of my sense of life, my preconceptual, emotionally integrated view of life, the childhood equivalent of a mature rational philosophy. It just so happened my father was a heroic figure, and through emotional associations, I came to admire and integrate people like my father, people who stood up for what they believed in, and of tremendous integrity. And that's been my policy now explicitly, not on the level of emotional subconscious, but on the explicit level of a conscious, mature, rational philosophy. I am a hero seeker. I was a much younger man in my mid-20s. Back in the 1970s, I was in my literary period, reading the classics and just about anything I could get my hands on. And by chance, I came across Atlas Shrugged in 1977. Read it more or less as a literary duty, enjoyed it, but was not overwhelmed by any of the philosophy. And then in 1980, I met a very impressive man, in fact, the most impressive individual I've ever met, a man here in Los Angeles named Rex Dante, fairly well known in certain circles here in Los Angeles as a philosopher. And upon first meeting him, I recognized that he was the man of the highest mind I'd ever met. And I asked him how he got like that, and he said, Ayn Rand. And I knew the name, and he suggested I pursue my readings of Ayn Rand, beginning with The Fountainhead, which I did read. In fact, that would have been my second book, of course, having read Atlas Shrugged prior. And from there on, I went to her nonfiction works, including the Romantic Manifesto, which, interestingly enough, is my favorite of all her books, as I'm not truly an artist. And the Romantic Manifesto is her statement on art, the virtue of selfishness, capitalism, the unknown ideal, and many others. Yes, I feel very fortunate to have lived in the time of Ayn Rand, and I've thought about that many times. I don't know where I'd be without objectivism. Exactly. I was always intellectually oriented, but there are a lot of people out there posing as intellectuals who don't impress me at all. In fact, many intellectuals claim the title based on an anti-intellectual approach to the intellect, believe it or not. Nietzsche was the only other philosopher who stimulated me, and it was because of his sense of life. He had a marvelous feeling about the greatness of man, which he wrote to express explicitly, but never at the same high level that Ayn Rand was able to achieve. As soon as I began reading Ayn Rand seriously after my meeting with Rex Dante, it didn't take long before I recognized quite clearly that she was beyond the pale, well beyond the pale, an epical genius, if you will. The reality we live in is the only reality there is. Things are what they are. Learn to use your mind to identify those things accurately and evaluate them. Don't turn your mind into a distorting agent. Don't use your mind to evade the facts of reality. Confront reality as it is, which is the principle of justice. A is A. Things are what they are. Nature, in order to be commanded, has to be obeyed. Part of nature is your own mind. It has an identity. Learn how to use it properly. To the extent that you do, you'll be happy and successful. To the extent that you evade that knowledge, you will be unhappy and unsuccessful. Without a doubt. This is a wonderful endeavor in and of itself. There's a lot of self-satisfaction to be derived from recognizing that you are able to discipline yourself and use a certain amount of knowledge to take yourself from point A to point C. Take your body from being average or below average to whatever it ultimately might be. But if you were to look deep down inside of yourself, get honest, what you're really looking for, even a businessman, somebody who wants to make a lot of money, $1 million, they do want the money, and that's fine and good. At bottom, the purpose of all goal achievement is to develop a sense of mastery, efficacy, to achieve a certain type of happiness that can only be had as a result of achieving goals. A lot of people find once they acquire the muscles they'd always dreamed of, they're not really different inside because they don't take this philosophical approach. The idea is to gain a sense of mastery, a sense of self-esteem, happiness, which can only be derived from achieving goals. You have to have that stated explicitly at the outset. If you think that you're going to end up having those things only as a result of having the muscles, and you don't work on developing other aspects of your life along with it, like your philosophy, then you're just going to end up with a set of muscles and be bereft of the rest. A lot of top bodybuilders, as top bodybuilders, of course, they have the big muscles, but they're self-arrested intellectually. They're no further ahead at the age of 30 or 40 mentally than they were 10 or 15 years ago when they started. They're psychologically beset by the same conflicts, the same sense of insecurity, uncertainty, self-doubt. They've got the big muscles, but they didn't get that sense of mastery. Self-esteem can only be achieved by starting the whole process by stating explicitly, not only do I want big muscles, but I want self-confidence. I can only get that by enjoying the process, gaining the knowledge, recognizing that I am a more effective person.
It's interesting, as gratifying as it is to receive emails, phone calls, letters every day from bodybuilders around the globe, thanking me for helping enlighten them with regards to a valid scientific approach to training. Much more gratifying is the overwhelming response that I've had the last several years from bodybuilders, thanking me for introducing them to Ayn Rand, objectivism, and the realm of the intellect.